Hello. The time is already the amount that we should start. If I may ask the people at the back of the... Hello. My name is Sandra Vallar. I'm a PhD student in Nordic history at Åbo Academy University. And I have a research position here at the Society of Swedish Literature in Finland. And SLS has kindly made it possible for me to organize this seminar that is thematically very closely linked to my doctoral thesis. And so I have the honor of welcoming all of you to Images as Normative Sources, 1850 to 1950. I also want to thank SLS for allowing me to organize this seminar in English, even though the Swedish language is central to the organization. I hope this won't exclude too many, because I know it has made it possible to include others. Next in turn, Ainur Elmgren, Associate Professor or Docent in Nordic History at Åbo Academy University, will talk about whiteness and masculinity in representations of Finns and Tatars. Quote, "The other was comely to behold." The topics of Ainur's research deals with the history of ideas and identities, as well as the history of minorities. She's currently a member of the research project Whose City, which is financed by the Coyne Foundation. And in this project, she studies how visual culture was used to address problems and inequalities in urban spaces, as well as hopes and fears about future that the transformative period of the 1960s and 1970s triggered in city planning and urban traffic. And in addition to research and teaching, she, like me, draws comics.
Thanks a lot for the lovely introduction, Sandra. Word of warning, I had to jump in at short notice, so I have kind of puzzled together a presentation, but it was also an opportunity because just a few weeks ago I found this funny picture, which is the first starting picture of my presentation. I will tell you more about it later. Let us leave it as a mystery for now. So, thanks a lot for coming here, and it's fun to have an audience both present and online, so I'm looking forward to questions, and I will try to make some time for the questions. I have unfortunately too many slides, but let's see what we can do with them. Oops. How do I get further? Sorry. Okay, sorry. So I would like to dedicate this presentation to my great-grand-uncle, Husnettin Bavautuddin. Later he picked the surname Abdrasak instead of Bavautuddin. And he, as you can see, had a photograph taken of him, which he later changed a little bit. He added a symbol to this copy of the photograph so that the Russian military shirt that he was wearing would not look too Russian. But you can see that it is a symbol that is probably of some significance, personal significance, but also collective significance to him. So these are examples of private photos, how a private individual might want to stage themselves and perhaps give an image of their idea of masculinity that they want to embody. But we will look more now at images intended for public consumption, although we cannot be sure if my great-grand-uncle perhaps also intended his photos to be viewed by a larger public because he took the effort of adding this symbol to them. So a little bit about my inspirations on this topic. So I'm a historian, but I have had a lot of help from social studies, social scientists who have studied the matter of representation, imagery, and especially gender and race in visual culture. And I would like to mention two British social scientists who have been extremely important to me. So the first one is Stuart Hall, a British Jamaican sociologist, who is credited with founding the discipline of cultural studies and who has studied how a culture's languages, signs, and images create a conceptual map that gives meaning to the world. And some of these signs and images are, of course, visual, that we are going to look closer at today, and there's a lot to say about different types of images. So I will try to be as brief as possible and give some examples rather than the big overview. So what I'm thinking about here is that the representativity of the images that I'm going to show to you can, of course, be questioned. You might ask, are these individual pictures really representative for a larger discourse, for a general trend in society? And I will try to respond to your answers then. So Stuart Hall studied how culture shapes our collective perceptions and how media representation reproduces forms of symbolic power. And one way this power could work is that, for example, minorities in a society have less power over their representations in media. So they might have a stronger sense of needing to stage themselves in a favorable light using the means and methods that are available to them. For example, private photography, as we have seen. These different ideas and symbols of power that I'm going to talk about can, of course, be described as social constructions. So, for example, when we talk about race, I'm talking about race as a social construction, as a way of organizing society, ordering society, and how images are used to create this order. We have seen excellent examples of this in Åsa's presentation. My examples will also be potentially problematic and perhaps offensive. They are perhaps of a milder variety because we might not today recognize the stereotypes and the offensive ideas that they allude to. So Stuart Hall studied how such interpretations of, for example, the construction of race function to express and reproduce power relations, and the importance in general of visuals in our image-saturated culture. I'm going to talk mainly about the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, so we can see how this image-saturated culture is starting to grow. Technological advances means that in the beginning of this period, there are not so many detailed pictures reproduced in the press, but towards the end, in the 30s, 40s, we see more accurate reproductions of photographs, more detailed photographs, and also cinema is taking over. So we can see how visuals, this image-saturated culture is starting to grow and take over. However, as Hall has stated, there are also other sensory representations that can be explored. And I will try to show some examples of them, but they are, of course, conveyed through text, through words. So people are describing their sensory, emotional reactions to images, or to both moving pictures and static images. And then I mentioned Stuart Hall. Michael Pickering is another British sociologist who has meant a lot to me. He has written a book called Stereotyping, where he describes how stereotypes function as order-making maps that are imposed on the world to make sense of the world. Of course, we might all argue that, yes, we need categories as thinking tools to make sense of the world. We have these maps in our mind that are simplified ways to depict the world, and of course we always have to be ready to adjust these tools of our minds when we are faced with new information. But stereotypes, unlike categories in general, stereotypes are perceived as fixed and immutable. So when faced with new information, we perhaps just categorize it as irrelevant. So the stereotype is so strong that there's something that makes us emotionally attached to it, that makes us perceive it as more important than our experience of actual reality. So there's something that we feel in the stereotypes is valuable for us to save and keep and hold on to. Perhaps it could be a sentimental value, for example, in stereotypes used in advertising. But still, even though we might perceive stereotypes, specific stereotypes, as even positive or sentimentally important to us, we must understand that they have come into being under specific power relations and historical circumstances. And that is what I'm going to explore now. So, I'm going to compare images of Finnish and Tatar men, and from the lenses, a kind of attempt at looking at them from the lens of representation of race, of whiteness, but also the lens of gender and, to a certain extent, class. So it's a lot, so I will not succeed in it completely, but I will give some hints of what to see in these images, how to interpret them. So in 1883, a Swedish edition in Sweden was published of the Tales of Ensign Ståhl, a literary classic of Swedish language Finnish literature in Sweden. It was written by Johan Ludvig Runeberg, of course, but it was illustrated by an artist from Sweden, August Malmström, and his illustrations were received in a rather negative way in Finland. And here are some examples. There's even the Swedish King Charles XII to the far right, and some pictures of Finnish soldiers, and it was these pictures of Finnish soldiers that people commented on, that they were not representative, and they did not like them, and they did not look like Finns. So, why was the reaction so strong? Now we have to go back in time further. So, we have the linguist and explorer Matthias Alexander Castrén, who was a really important researcher of the relations between languages and who traveled a lot in the Russian Empire, doing ethnographical studies, anthropological studies, and also linguistic studies of many of the peoples of the far north in the Russian Empire that he already knew might have languages that were related to the Finnish language distantly, the Finno-Ugric language family. And he created a theory in the 1840s that there was this large language family group, the Ural-Altaic language family, which was not just a question of languages being related to each other, but actually languages could tell something about human beings being related to each other. So for him it was a happy discovery, because the Finnish tribe, which until recently has remained unnoticed and unreasonably disregarded in world history, would now come in contact with all Altaic nations and find support and a starting point for its own history from theirs. And his definition of Altaic languages was very wide. He did not only include Turkic languages, but also Manchu, Tungus languages, those languages that were called Samoyedic then. And because China back then was ruled by the Qing dynasty of Tungus, that is Manchu origin, Castrén made the claim that, well, we are actually part of many, many millions of people now. We are not alone. We are not just stuck in our swamp in the forest, all alone, nobody to support us. And in a letter to the national philosopher Johan Wilhelm Snellman, he actually also elaborated the idea that when there comes a time that these peoples, these more populous nations in the Russian Empire, rise up to fight against Russia and to fight for their independence, then we will be able to cheer them on from our swamps and say like, hey, yes, now is our chance as well. But it was not really a matter of putting Finland into the driver's seat, more like Finland could ride on the tailcoats of these other nations that would be the main moving power of this great uprising. Of course, Castrén was quite alone with this idea, and it was not something you could say out loud back then. So it remained in the correspondence between him and Snellman. Well, unfortunately, at the same time, as many of our colleagues in the room can tell us in more detail about the racial theories and scientific racism that European thinkers were developing at the time, were not in favor of this sort of great positive identification over these national borders. So, for example, Linnaeus, I mentioned here just some examples of these thinkers and philosophers and natural scientists, Linnaeus, Blumenbach and Goldschmidt, and they all placed the Asian race or the Homo asiaticus or the Mongol race, the Tatar race, whichever concept they choose, it was always placed hierarchically below the white race or the Caucasian race or whatever they wanted to call the head race. Asianness was associated with deviation from the classical ideal. And even Castrén himself referred to the despised Mongols in a kind of paradiastolic way. Paradiastole is a rhetorical device where you reframe a vice as a virtue. So you mention something negative, but you say that, hey, actually this isn't that bad. If they might call us Asians, but hey, come on, there are millions of us. There are more of us than them. And this will be a recurring trait in the Finnish handling of this suspicion of being related to Asian peoples. Here's just an example of the kind of maps that were spread in the Western world at the time, and they also spread to the East. This is a German lexicon with a map where the so-called yellow race is, of course, tinted in yellow, and we see how it extends far into the Lapland, also in Norway and Sweden. But, of course, it's covering Finland and Estonia. And, in fact, we can see that Turkey isn't quite as yellow as Finland is here, so it's kind of interspersed with the light blue of the European so-called Aryans. Here we have the Finnish tribes or nations, and just in the neighborhood we have the so-called Tatars. So we are talking about enduring stereotypes. So if Linnaeus in the 19th century described his category of Homo asiaticus as yellow, melancholic, rigid, severe, haughty, avaricious, covered with loose clothes and ruled by opinions, a Finnish newspaper report more than 100 years later, when the first Tatar merchants started to arrive in Finnish towns and marketplaces, used a lot of these similar descriptions to describe these new traders that they were seeing in the marketplaces. Their behavior is proud and insolent. Their external appearance is perfectly Mongolian. These strange guests from Far Eastern lands are no comely people, rather the opposite. Well, at the same time, what were Tatars thinking? In fact, the ethnonym Tatar was controversial because it was being used in a very derogatory way by the neighboring peoples and also by the ruling nation of the Russian Empire, the Russians. So it was used by the Russians of almost all Muslim Turkic-speaking peoples in the empire and also a little bit outside of it, and also some peoples that were not Muslim but were speaking Turkic languages. For example, the Azeris were referred to as mountain Tatars in the late 19th century. So, in Kazan, the theologian and historian Shihabeddin Marjani decided that we should reclaim this ethnonym. Let them call us Tatars. If we choose something different, if we call us Turks, if we call us Bulgars, if we call us by any other option that there exists, the Russians will still turn it into a negative word. So we might as well stick to Tatar. And in this category, or this notion of Tatarness, he combined several historical legacies, the Islamic tradition of the Volga-Bulgarian Khanate or empire from the 900s, onward, and the history of the Golden Horde that of course was started by a non-Muslim, the sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan, but nevertheless became Muslim quite soon, and its successor state, the Kazan Khanate, was also a Muslim realm. So it was important to stick to this, to Islam, the religion as the core of the identity, but also the language, the Turkic languages that combined, that united a lot of these disparate peoples in the Russian Empire. And How the Tatars came to Finland, I've tried to map it out for you. So here you can see between Moscow and Kazan, the blue star, that's the villages of origin for most of the Finnish Tatar families that live here today. And the expansion of the railroad network led to the connection between Russia and Finland, so they could, by train, not by horse or by any other old historical means of conquest, reach all the way to the mainly the coastal towns in Finland with marketplaces and buying customers, but also to some of the cities in the country. I show you some examples of Tatar traders as they were depicted in cartoons at the time and also on the stage. So you can see that these figures are quite similar. So by the 1910s, at least, there was an established stereotype, visual stereotype of an itinerant Tatar trader, somebody who would either walk from door to door and try to sell his goods or go to the marketplace and spread out the stuff that was in this bundle. And you can also notice that this figure is a bit orientalized with the eyes very narrow, and he is also beardless, and above all he's male. And the beardlessness is a specific trait of these images in Finland because there are similar images and cartoons in Russia, but there the Tatar is always depicted with a beard. And my theory is that in Finland it was mainly the younger men that were sent out to trade like this, while their older relatives, their fathers, uncles, grandfathers, were trying to establish permanent shops, and they were supervising the warehouses, and they were sending out their younger relatives to trade among the people, so to speak. So if you want to read more about these visual stereotypes, I have an open access publication on the topic, which is referred to here. Well, then of course came the encounters between the people that were living in the towns, that were mostly at home when traders came around, and this also led to reactions in the press where there was perhaps mainly mockery and also disapproval directed at the Finnish women who were suspected to be initiating these contacts. So it was not like the Tatar men, often very young men, were depicted as the guilty, the active part. Well, there were some news like that, but in the longer articles and in the cartoons, it was usually the Finnish woman who was taking the initiative, and it also took on this racializing the fear of producing mixed children that would not be visually Finnish. Chinese, Tatars, Kalmyks, and God knows what else. So we see how Tatars are lumped together with other Asians. But, however, what I've found in sources produced by female authors is quite a different image. There is the attractive other. The other was comely to behold, a quote from the Bible which appears in this Swedish language women's journal, where the image on the right is from. And it's a reference to the beautiful prophet Joseph, as all Tatars would recognize immediately, because the story of Joseph and his love story with Potiphar's wife, which has a happy ending in the Muslim tradition, unlike in the Christian tradition where Potiphar's wife is a terrible villain. In the Muslim version, they get each other in the end, and everybody is happy. So I really love this fan fiction version that has been extremely influential in Tatar popular culture, but also in Persian culture and among many Muslim peoples in Central Asia especially. And there's also a quote from a short story by a female author who published a lot of short stories in the press and who had very strong... unfortunately, I forgot her true name, but I think her surname was Grönstrand. Unfortunately, she's forgotten like many other female authors, but there are some articles about her. And she's the only one I've seen writing a fictional story from this time, from the 1890s, where the young Tatar man is the clear love interest, even though the love story doesn't have a happy ending. The mother chases him away. But the description is only positive. There's nothing negative in this description. And there is even a touch of orientalization in this, so it's not like his assumed Asianness is denied. It's part of his attraction. So what did Finns do about these stereotypes that were projected on them as well? Well, here we have the concept of paradiastole again, so trying to turn these negative associations of Asianness, of being not a classical beauty according to the norms of the racial hierarchies, into a source of strength, even though it's a bit carnivalistic and it's a bit challenging to the authorities that be. So to the left we have a cartoon by Erik Waström in the Swedish language satirical magazine Fyren. He was actually jailed for this cartoon for 3 months because it was seen as lèse majesté. So the cartoon was illustrating a story or a poem about the Russian nobility or the Russian imperial family having a holiday in Finland. Showing a member maybe of the Russian court dancing with this sort of Finnish peasant with a knife and everything, unshaved, looking a bit like Uno Turhapuro, this popular comedy character from the 80s. So this was seen as an insult to the majesty. Of course we could discuss, well, Waström was a Swedish speaker, so he was probably not personally identifying with this character, but then we have Tycho Salinen's art, which was also criticized for showing Finnish peasants as Asian-looking, and his art was very popular in the neighboring countries and in Europe, so the fear was that, for example, Swedes or Norwegians or other Europeans would interpret these paintings as accurate ethnographic depictions of the Finnish people. And of course, this is connected with the fear that was rising of the political radicalization of the common people. So here we see a crowd during the general strike of 1905, where many parts of the Finnish bourgeoisie especially became aware of the fact that there was a huge labor movement in the country and that there were people who intended to be active in politics outside of the traditional parties or organizations. So are we talking about auto-exotism or classism or something else when the own people is depicted as racially deviant or alien or not according to the classical norms of what white Caucasian people should look like? And what is happening in Finnish media at this time, we see that negative phenomena within the nation, especially among the common people, are often denounced as non-Western, either directly outside influences like contamination from the East, Russian agitators coming into the country, or otherwise some sort of vague contamination, or hereditary condition that is explicitly connected to that. Yes, we have part of our heritage is from the East, and this might cause some atavistic behaviors to surface at times. And here's a cartoon of peasants in Savolax in the east of Finland who the daughter of the family has come back from Helsinki and is showing off the latest dance steps. So the cartoonist is clearly making fun of the fact that she's out of place, being fashionable and among her family, which luckily seems to take it with a sense of humor. Of course, the outside view was a problem here, so when the problem is always, what will the Swedes think? What will the Swedes say? Because from the Swedish side, the Swedish media, which Finns, of course, followed very actively at this time, even this national characteristic of sisu could be interpreted as a sort of Asian attribute, like in this article in Dagens Nyheter from 1912, 26, where somebody, an anonymous person who is like the devil's advocate in the conversation, is saying that to the other gentleman, because of course only men are speaking, that isn't there a word in Chinese which is perhaps pronounced ki, maybe they mean she or something else, and which has the same meaning as sisu. So it's impossible to translate. But it should be the moment when the calm and collected Chinese throws off his impenetrable shell, and then the devil is loose. Doesn't that say something to the gentleman that sisu could be a Mongolian attribute? Well, of course it was not fun for Finns to hear that, and there were also strong reactions in the Finnish press, and many ways to participate in international competitions like sports or beauty contests were also framed as a competition to show, to prove that Finns were part of the white race. We are not Mongols is the headline of one article here from the 30s, and then the rhetorical questions, who are we? The juxtaposition of a picture of an unidentified Asian man and a Finnish peasant who is presented by name is intended to show that, of course, these are two very different individuals with different origins. But it was still stated that we have to demonstrate explicitly until our scientists can prove without a doubt that we are a nation with many good qualities. And in the Finnish original, what they mean with demonstration is that you have to show, you have to make it visible. Because already in the 20s, even the racial scientists knew that race was in the eye of the beholder. The more they measured, the more ambiguous the results looked. So the so-called Mongolian fold, which for a long time was seen as an exclusive attribute of the Asian race, was actually found among many Europeans as well, white Europeans. So as a physiognomical feature, it cannot be used to distinguish between races or as some sort of hint. So here is a short quote by a social democrat archaeologist and who was writing about race in the 20s. So they started to look inside the human being as well, the build of the skeleton and the differences in the inner organs. But as perhaps some of us already know in the audience, that this did not bring them any further, but instead complicated things even more. So what was the problem actually? Many newspapers and commentators complained about this false testimony that Finns were associated with Mongols and Asians. We are being caused evident and what's worse, willful damage, they stated. Well, one reason was the big Finnish population in the United States, in Canada, and in Australia, where there were very strict racial regimes. And also, Finns were in danger of having limited immigration numbers in the United States because they were classified as Asian or Mongolian. So they turned to the authorities. An esteemed professor has stated that we have no closer racial connection to the Mongols, but Finns are in fact the whitest people in the world. So this esteemed professor, who we see in a Mongol costume here in the picture, was Geir Ramstedt, who was by no means any racial scientist. He was not studying biological race or physiognomy or anything. He was a linguist, again like Castrén. And here we see him in the Mongolian steppe with Sakari Pälsi, the archaeologist, and they are having a meal with Darja and Balgir, their guides. And for Ramstedt, this was a linguistic matter. He disproved Castrén's theory of a Ural-Altaic language family, but he had no problems supporting Mongolian independence movement, supporting also Tatar activists and Tatar independence movement in Finland. And he named his children, he gave his children names that are Turkic or Altaic, so to speak. So in a way, he was an Turanian or Ural-Altaic brotherhood activist in spirit. And I have written more about this in this open access publication, so you can look deeper into that topic. Well, Then this whole matter of Mongolian race was even more exciting because there was one historical individual who was associated with the Asian race and the Mongolian race who had actually managed to put the fear of God into the Europeans at the time, and that was, of course, Genghis Khan, the great conqueror. So Genghis Khan's name was often used to show that perhaps other conquerors, other fearsome political leaders at the time had something to do with him, were perhaps his descendants either spiritually or even biologically. So here's one quote which is about Lenin, which is talking about his obvious Mongol type and how his father was born in Astrakhan, where the Kipchak Tatars, Kipchak is a family of Turkic languages, was from. And he is, in other words, a successful heir of the bloody Genghis Khan, not just spiritually, but also possibly biologically. But then it could also be used in a conversation within Finland that since the days of Genghis Khan has the world not known such a harsh punisher as the Finnish white man in 1918. And of course this white man is a political white man, and it was written by a social democrat satirist in just a few years after the Finnish Civil War. But this was also a way of, perhaps in a similar sense to paradiastolle, to turning the tables around those that claim that they are at the peak of the hierarchy, that they are the whitest also in the political sense, are actually the ones that behave like barbarians. Well, was Genghis Khan a barbarian to the Tatars? Well, this is complicated because, of course, he wasn't a Muslim, so he can't be depicted as a Muslim hero. But his descendants created great khanates, great states that the Tatars wanted to claim. So, of course, in a way, they tried to claim Genghis Khan as well. And the Bashkir revolutionary and nationalist Zeki Validi Togan argued that Genghis Khan was ethnically a Kara Tatar, like black Tatar, so perhaps hinting at some sort of racial difference within the Tatar category, but still he was the progenitor of both Tatar and Mongol civilizations. And as a Bashkir, Togan was kind of seen as a separatist from Kazan Tatar perspective, so his opponents wanted to argue with him and wanted to specify that Genghis Khan was a Tatar hero, and this could be connected with the fact that Tatar nationalism in general is a bit more world-embracing than, for example, Bashkir nationalism or other smaller Turkic groups that claim to have their own identity in resistance to this kind of Tatar. You can perhaps compare with Turkish nationalism, where everybody is potentially a Turk, so inclusiveness can sometimes go too far. And here are some maps that Finnish Tatars used after examples from abroad to show how Russia should be divided into ethnic territories, ethnic states, in the case that resistance succeeded against the Soviet Union. And here we see the Idel-Ural region, so it's at the Volga, which is Idel in Tatar, in both maps here in the what we perhaps see today as the heartland of Russia, which is in Tatar point of view actually not historically that Russian. These maps were also spread in Finnish media because Tatars wanted to show, and as you see on this newspaper page, there are also pictures of human beings, there are pictures of men, very warlike men with huge weapons and helmets and other gear, to show that Tatars were a warlike people historically. They did not surrender automatically to the Russians, and they continued to fight against Moscow after the fall of Kazan in 1552. And this was something that, an image that Tatars promoted to a Finnish audience, because in the 30s there was a boom also for militant nationalism from the Finnish side, in the Finnish media. And this supported the idea of common united front against the Soviet Union or the Russians. And also to remind the Finns that Tatars were not the same as Russians, to fight against these negative stereotypes that had been inherited from the time before independence, which were often a way of criticizing Russia without mentioning Russia. So instead of criticizing Russia, Finnish media was talking about those evil Tatars. And this narrative somehow lives on in a different way. Here's a quote from a couple of years ago where the leaders of the local Tatar community, chairwoman Gulten Bedreddin and Imam Ramil Belyayev, are explaining that perhaps of our warrior background, it was clear to us that we would defend Finland, to show that Tatars are patriotic Finns because they descend from these warlike people. And in fact, there were many Tatar intellectuals from Russia who escaped the Bolshevik Revolution and came to Finland, and Finland became a meeting point for these Tatar intellectuals who also like to depict themselves here in an all-male company. They were also female activists, but I have found very few photos of them. These photos were distributed and copied among Tatars all over the world in the diaspora to show that, yes, we are everywhere, we have contacts, we stick together. And Finns somehow benefited from this, let's say, Turkish connection, because many of these Tatar activists went to Turkey and found good positions there. But already before that, Finns were surprised to find, when Finland became independent, that Turkey had quite a positive image of Finland. And it might not be a bad idea to advertise to Turkey and other Turkic nations, and to Hungary and Estonia, of course, but mainly to those states that had power, that they were, if they believe that we are related, okay, let them believe that. It's to our benefit. And I have written a little bit more about this pan-nationalist perspective in this publication, which is also open access. So we come to the funny picture that I had in the beginning. So what does it show? It's from 1935, when a certain trend was being observed among young far-right activists, poets, especially authors, students, who started to use Genghis Khan and the so-called Asian hordes, this militant aspect of an Asian stereotype that was popular at the time, as a positive reference. And of course this cartoon is skeptical to the whole thing. It shows a conservative priest and theologian, Yrjö Alanen, who is sarcastically commenting the young men who are saluting Genghis Khan on his throne and praising the strong blood of the barbarians. That you would think that that kind of verses come from the pen of some modern fanatical Bolshevik poet. So we have this association again between, yeah, it would be proper for the left to salute Genghis Khan because we don't expect anything better from them, but this is going too far. And there were, of course, many young men who were part of this trend, but I want to mention especially Paavo Hynynen, who has an Oulu connection, and since I kind of represent Oulu here now, I don't want to miss the opportunity. There was a publication, a journal in Oulu on cultural topics called Ahjo, and it was edited by very far-right nationalist young activists. And Paavo Hynynen published many of his poems here, which very eloquently depict a kind of charge against the West, with Genghis Khan as the main actor here, and the riders of Asia are storming. And there were also some prose articles by other authors in this magazine that lamented the poetry, Finnish nationalist poetry of the day, that it wasn't warlike enough. We should look at Japan. Look how effective they are in the Far East, so we should be more like them. Now, from the image perspective, Paavo Hynänen, even though he has a sad fate, he's kind of interesting example because his photos were posthumously duplicated and published in many magazines and newspapers, commemorating him as fallen in the continuation war in the summer of 1941. And all the images show him in this, what is called a true costume of a Lapland wanderer or a Lapland man. So they are avoiding the term which was used of the Sami people back then, Lappalainen, which would perhaps have been used in a different context. So this is his costume. It belongs to him when he is exploring Lapland as a white Finnish man who is in charge, but also in the other text he's called a scout boy in the costume of a Lapland man. So the reference to scout boy is of course because the magazine it was published in was intended for scouts as reading material, but it might also emphasize that he died too young, that he had not had the opportunity to grow into full manhood and show what he was capable of. So it's part of the mourning process as well that these memorial images had gained a nostalgic value, and they were supposed also to evoke pathetic and emotionally strong reactions in the viewer. So I come to the final example, which I'm going to dig a bit deeper into. I still have some time, that's great. So one person who was really testing the limits of masculinity and race in many ways was the actor and director Theodor Tugai, who had Tatar origins from Latvia, the border region of Latvia and Lithuania back in the early 20th century, was inhabited and in some parts still is by Tatars who arrived there considerably earlier than the Tatar population in Finland. So there's a long tradition of Muslim villages in this area, and both his father and his mother descended from these families. But he grew up in Finland, in Helsinki, and he started out as a young actor, very enthusiastic about the new film medium, but the reception of his characters that he started with playing ethnic characters. He had a role as a sort of a romantic gypsy seducer, but the critic, according to the critic, he did not quite succeed in this racial masquerade. His true colors shone through. And another film critic was also complaining that his features verge on the Chinese and his expressions too. And then another critic thought that he did not appear Finnish and his type is not particularly attractive, period. So he was kind of panned. And there's more to say about that, but I would like to remind you that as Teuvo Tulio, when he changed his name into a more Finnish-sounding one, he gained more fame behind the camera than in front of it. And he is the author of some of the most iconic Finnish cinema produced in the 40s, 50s, 60s. So as a director, he's kind of inescapable in Finnish movie history. Am I running late?
Less time for questions. We start rounding up.
Yeah, okay. Just a few more words about Tulio. So I'm going to skip all these very negative comments, which you have already seen, and the context, the questionable masculinity, and kind of what he should be doing anyway. But when a straight woman reviewed his, or I assume she was straight, I can't be sure, the text was quite different. And then it was a total success. And it was so wonderful and so charming. And of course, when a Finnish man did the same thing and was kind of a bit queering masculinity, it was more okay, it could pass without comment racializing him. And he also had in Swedish cinema this role as where he was perceived as actually an accurate or authentic interpreter of the role. But in the end, I want to show the picture of my great granduncle again, a little older. And this is also a way of staging yourself when you have total command of how you should look in the picture. And perhaps this tells you also about something about our family connections, even though I didn't know him. But this, now you listen to me, gesture is very, very eloquent, and I would like to end with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ainur. What wonderful presentation. We have 5 minutes of time for questions, so I think maybe 3 or 2 if they're long. So if it's one from the chat.
Yes, here is a long question from the chat. Thanks again for this talk. Again, really interesting. I got curious about the stereotyping of Tatars and their lack of a beard. You presented a feasible theory that this has to do with the actual experiences of a specific young demographic of Tatar peddlers. But I wonder whether this might also be a way of demeaning or emasculating Tatars, especially if they were perceived as engaging in illicit relationships with Finnish women, as another way of making these relationships seem unacceptable or culturally or racially inappropriate. Perhaps even as a way of dissuading Finnish women from associating with Tatar men. It was interesting in this context that the picture that you had paired with a text by a women writer, this figure has thick hair and a moustache, albeit clean-shaven, an aesthetic associated with cultured masculine European men. Do we see women reproducing stereotypes of a bare-faced, possibly more effeminate Tatar, or is this also a product of male fears?
That was an excellent question, and luckily I don't have a very long answer to that. I think it's a great hypothesis, and I would also support it. Although there was this one quote from a story by Saima, the female author whose name I could not recall, who describes a love story developing between a young Finnish girl, probably like 16, 17, and a Tatar boy the same age, and he is described as beardless. So that would be the exception that proves the rule, maybe.
I think if we switch places, and if you can present our next speaker.
Thank you, and sorry, in fact, for taking so much of your time. I don't want to waste anything of the following speaker's time. I just need to find my notes. So I would like to introduce to you Anna Carden-Coyne. And Anna is Professor of History at the University of Manchester. She is Director of the Center for the Cultural History of War, and professionally a cultural historian and a curator with much experience in both curating exhibitions and editing and writing publications. And this time she will talk to us about displacement aesthetics, visual tropes of refugees and refugeedom. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Anna. Do you think we can turn this row of lights off? Just wondering if it would, just the pictures might be a bit better. I wonder if anyone will understand me if I say, tack för jobbet. Close? I do want to thank SLS for inviting me, and to Sandra Valla and to Kaisa for this honoured invitation. It's really a great opportunity to talk with other cultural historians about images and their impact. And I do also want to thank the two previous speakers, to Oysa and to Ainur, because their research, I think, will also help us to think through representations of refugees. And it's great to actually go back to Stuart Hall, as you started with. That was a really timely reminder to think about Stuart Hall again. So refugees, migrants and asylum seekers are at the forefront of international politics as populations defined by crisis, while the United Nations and humanitarian agencies attempt to bridge gaps in national politics on aid and resettlement. Well, social historians have tackled this subject at length, especially the creation of the international refugee regime in the aftermath of the Second World War, and also have been very concerned with the social experience of refugeedom, using Peter Gattrell's term, refugeedom. However, attention to visual and material representations tend to be illustrative, tend to be sort of used in passing rather than deeply analysed. Since the invention of photography, such images have reproduced familiar tropes of refugees and forced displacement that entail identifiable forms within recognisable and accessible iconography of symbols and associated material objects. And over time, conventions are reproduced and visual tropes traverse seamlessly backwards and forwards across time, space and geography. And so visual tropes can seem at once highly contemporary and speaking to the moment of a declared crisis, while also suggesting the ahistorical and universal condition of humanity. So appearing in various cultural forms and spaces, from photography and newsreel to posters and visual art, what my project calls Displacement Aesthetics constructs normative images that shape knowledge and affective emotions about refugees as people and refugeedom as an experience. Images sustain the dialectical relationship of outsider to insider, reinforcing norms of belonging and values associated with good citizenship, such as economic and political participation or input, which is crucial for resettlement and labour migration. NGOs or charities, humanitarian agencies, often produce idealised images of refugee families and youth who could be workers helping to build or rebuild a nation. Images of happy refugees also demonstrate the success of United Nations organisations and others in rehabilitating refugees, especially former labour camp inmates and Jewish survivors of the Second World War. So I hope today to explore the refugee and the displaced person as a cultural figure whose aestheticisation in the 20th century has come to stand in for the very condition of displacement and refugeedom. So first of all, I don't want to read this out, but this paper stems from a 3-year project that I have, that I'm leading, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, called Understanding Displacement Aesthetics and Making Change in the Art Gallery with Refugees, Migrants and Host Communities. And if I had my time again, and I've said this before, I wouldn't use the term host communities. It's a very problematic term, but there's something to be said about that. And we're working with the Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester and Manchester Art Gallery with artists and curators from backgrounds of forced displacement, where we're hoping to overturn some of the tropes that we're looking at today. So I won't go into too much detail about our definition, but just to perhaps that second paragraph there that says, Displacement aesthetics encompasses both the visible and invisible forces, meaning that legal and social and economic barriers impacting displaced people's everyday lives produce aesthetic outcomes, and that displacement aesthetics understands aesthetics as being both representational and operational. So we can come back to that. So in our definition, we have these sort of four modes, and today I just want to talk about mode 1, which is visual tropes. So visual tropes mode 1 refers to persistent visual tropes and normative iconographies, the figure of the refugee has sustained historical and cultural meaning over time. Now, there are antecedents, especially in the First World War and Spanish Civil War periods, that were consolidated during the Second World War, that have aestheticised the refugee and imagined refugee experiences in familiar ways that create an aesthetic vocabulary of displacement. Visual tropes appear in diverse cultural arenas: media, photojournalism, the United Nations' own journalistic photography, whether it be such as UNRWA, the IRO, UNESCO, UNICEF, humanitarian photography, charity aid posters, and visual artists. Sometimes visual artists working with charities. And this has also influenced contemporary artists, and I've just got down there a little picture from Ai Weiwei's Law of the Journey series and Ben Quilty's painting series, an Australian artist. Both those artists, contemporary artists, have spent time in refugee camps and have also reproduced tropic images. So displacement aesthetics are often gendered, racialised, dehistoricised, and deny geographic specificity. They are displaced and homogenised. And we've identified in our team of art historians, and art theorists and curators sort of these 5 connected tropes. Mobility and immobility through such themes as exodus, sanctuary, stasis, waiting, the crowd, woman and child, often a mother, lone child or lone children, and a more emergent image or a more emergent theme of material culture, particularly resonant in museums and in contemporary art, such as collections of suitcases, life jackets, images of passports in art, and boats, of course. David Farrier writes that to become a refugee is declaratory rather than constitutive, and the discretionary rights of recognition reside with the state. Hospitality is thus conditional. However, in the 1940s, the state did not provide much financial support, and it was charities and often female philanthropists who did provide relief in the form of working with charities and also constructed for sort of in terms of hospitality. With the emergence of the United Nations after the war and its multi-agencies such as UNRWA to care for refugees, the liminality of statelessness revealed, and indeed according to Hannah Arendt, that the figure of the refugee signals a crisis of the polis and that this loss has expelled man from humanity. Now, arguably, this is even more so for women and children, whose political status was more disputed than male citizens, and whose citizen status cannot be mobile and transferable when on the move. The earliest moving images of refugees emerging during the First World War came in the form of newsreels from France and Belgium, of people evacuating towns and cities along roads on foot and by horse-drawn cart, escaping the advancing German army. Silent newsreels were played in cinemas and were accompanied by captions that described the unutterable woes felt by such exiles. Moving images helped to capture the mobility of the refugee in flows and queues, streaming past the camera on the road to somewhere. Newsreels conveyed immediacy, temporal urgency, and supported humanitarian fundraising efforts, such as for the Red Cross and other charities, in an era before the formation of the UN, or UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or later the IRO, International Refugee Organisation. And newsreels were impactful for audiences because they were featured in cinemas, and they were the beginning of the news media industry that would dominate public perceptions of refugees for the next century. The First World War refugees were also frequently the subject of visual artists, both as witnesses in Europe or sent there to capture the events. And in England, the Imperial War Museum had a huge war artists commission program, which was also repeated in Canada and in Australia. And they continues today, where artists are selected and sent to war zones to capture the events. Artworks were titled with emotive terms such as the homeless, unhappy traveller, as well as the popularity of biblical themes. Exodus, the foundational narrative of Abrahamic faiths, told the Old Testament story of the Israelites' departure from Egypt in 1200 BC. A central iconography of Western art. It concerns a master narrative of border crossing, where sea and desert are spaces of both liminality and transit. The image of flight is thus embedded in Western imaginaries. And this religious heritage was reprised time and time again across the century. In the Spanish Civil War, photographs of refugees were represented as a biblical event, the departure of 500,000 Catholic Spaniards to camps in neighbouring France and elsewhere across the world. These were both political and humanitarian images, for they were not just fleeing the front line of or bombed villages, but were now the deliberate targets of fascist munitions. Internationally circulated images served as a compelling call to the world by the various Republican propaganda agencies, as well as independent freelance photographers such as Robert Capa, Gerda Taro, and David Chim Seymour, who were urging nations to provide sanctuary. In 1941, the French reprised the term l'exode, or exodus, to refer to the specific event of the mass civilian departures from Paris, when around 6 million people fled to the south of the country to escape German occupation. This was documented extensively by photographers and agencies such as the company Roger Violet, founded by husband and wife team Hélène Roger and Jean Fichet in 1938. The repeated visual tropes become so familiar, but also suggest the exclusion of other narratives, the other ways of understanding the diversity of such experiences. And many French artists repeated the same thing. They too had experienced the upheaval, but responded very quickly to the events and found compelling ways of understanding it. They titled their works also Exodus, such as Robert Houdous, André Dupin, and many others who depict anonymous figures moving in one direction. Artists provided their talents to relief campaigns as well, helping to shape the image of the mobile refugee, and worked with humanitarian organisations to raise awareness, to raise funds, and also to impact migration policy. Additionally, tropes such as Exodus provided storytelling conventions and aesthetic symbols that resonate with social and cultural meaning, and this perhaps is also for those who had experienced displacement and cultural and linguistic disorientation. Such stories resonated with those artists very personally, and one case and example is Marc Chagall. With the sudden death of his wife Bella in 1944 in New York, where he was a refugee, Chagall worried that the exile from Europe had sapped her will to live. His grief deepened with the news of the Nazi death camps. His return to biblical themes had a deeper resonance on the fate of European Jewry, and he returned to France in 1947. In 1948, he painted the boat Exodus, depicting either his own flight from France on the SS Sinai in 1941, or perhaps the fate of the Zionist ship Exodus, carrying 4,000 Jewish refugees and Holocaust survivors to Palestine, which had been turned back the year before by the British. After his first visit to Israel in 1951, he began his colossal painting Exodus between 1952 and 1966, which depicts Jesus rather than Moses in the flight from Egypt. In a later suite of 23 lithographic prints, Exodus, 1966, he brought together the themes of the Passover, Easter, European anti-Semitism, among other themes, Moses, the Ten Commandments, and Madonna and Child. One of the plates seems like an advancing throng, a crowd on the move. Assisted out of Nazi-occupied France by American journalist Varian Fry's rescue boat, the SS Sinea, under the auspices of the Emergency Rescue Committee, which is now, of course, the International Rescue Committee, Varian Fry once again encouraged Marc Chagall to produce work for the IRC, and this came in the form of the Flight portfolio, which was also used in the 1970s by the IRC. And each plate by many different artists refers to Aeneas fleeing the burning city of Troy, and also different people fleeing. And these kind of practices around using art have been sustained in the way that museums right up to today have been highlighting this kind of work about what the world would look like without refugees, particularly the cultural world. Another trope is that of the crowd. Images of both mobility and immobility persistently convene around the idea of the crowd, whether flowing in groups along roads or stuck at borders and in camps. The crowd is never an individual or even a family group, but rather groups or columns of nameless, anonymous, and often faceless and unidentifiable people moving together as one mass. The crowd is a phenomenon of modernity, an emblem of cities, a political symbol of assembly, revolution and collective action, and a form of psychology and social behaviour. Also has negative associations with madness, delusion, and mob violence. As an undefined mass, the crowd also speaks to the definition of crisis, to volume. The media frequently refers, even recently, for example, to Syria as the largest displacement since the Second World War, which is a discourse on excess. Artists who played their part in this imaginary include, we can go right back to the First World War, for example, the Welsh artist Frank Brengwen, his series Refugees Leaving Antwerp, in 1914, is a dark image of throng of people traversing the landscape, leaving the city behind them, children clinging to parents, men with fists raised at the advancing German army. Brengwen, as I mentioned before, was also an official war artist. And these were sort of somewhere between art, propaganda images. They were mass-produced. They came in poster formats. They went in newspapers. They came in postcard formats. And that circulation of imagery is how a lot of this stuff can be recirculated and reframed and repositioned. And art institutions collected all of this work around the world. In the Spanish Civil War, Republican refugees fleeing Franco's bombing became the standard image of democracy and the need for aid among democratic allies. Recently, Richard Moss has tried to unpack such notions of anonymity of the crowd in his use of heat mapping technologies in the notorious Moria camp in Lesbos. It also serves as a kind of protest against the very technology of crowd surveillance. But we can also see that contemporary artists, and I won't really have time to go into this today, but it's another part of our project, which is to look at the way that some artists in more contemporary times have tried to sort of address the trope, use the tropes, and then kind of intervene in them. And we're working with a group of artists who are doing that in those two museums I mentioned before. But crowds have long been associated with threat and ambiguity. When the picture post depicted German refugee children in an Austrian camp reaching out for food aid, the audience immediately understands the meaning of a hand raised. That without food and without rehabilitation, they could become little Hitlers in the future, a theme of threat famously explored in the Oscar-winning US War Department propaganda film Seeds of Destiny 1946, which sought funding for UNRWA to support European orphaned and homeless children. Otherwise, they would become little Totos or little Hitlers. In the context of crowded ships of Jewish migration to Palestine, the British deemed this highly illegal, such as passengers of the Haganah ship Exodus found themselves in 1947, who were then interned in Cyprus. In the context of the Cold War, the conformist actions of a crowd seem dangerous, the opposite of democratic individualism. By the time of the Vietnam War, the racialization of the refugee, in concert with Cold War fears of communist takeover, meant that the West also depicted the fleeing as an impoverished crowd, as a dangerous political burden the boats may have harboured infiltrating communists. Correlating to images of mobility and exodus, however, is that of immobility, stasis and encampment. Rushby's commissioned work for the Hall of Remembrance in London depicted Belgian refugees in Earl's Court. But at this very time, 200,000 refugees were being officially remembered by the state in this history painting at the very same time as they were being forcibly repatriated. The British state had ended its temporary sanctuary. In the Second World War in the 1940s, artists such as Joseph Herman, who was a Jewish refugee to Scotland, recalled the stuckness of waiting with nowhere to go. Waiting is a common theme in photography as well, waiting for passage and rescue, waiting with few belongings, and there's much to be said about the material culture of belongings. This is exemplified in a 1940 headline in Britain's progressive pictorial newspaper, Picture Post, accompanied by the photo on the lower right. The text read, "The symbolic figure of our age, the refugee, driven out, persecuted, hunted down, the symbolic figure of our age is a figure on the run." Now, this was a liberal anti-fascist newspaper that campaigned to protect Jews. It sold over 1.9 million copies during the war. And this story was penned by Norman Angell, who was a renowned English journalist and Nobel Prize laureate in 1933. And the page design was dominated by a close-up photograph of a husband and wife bearing dazed stares, clasped to knees, sitting motionless, squatting on the ground with meagre belongings. They were stuck, their capacity to move blocked. The cultural figure of the refugee was, by 1940, becoming a normative image and one without a voice. And this question of voicelessness is crucial to understanding why tropes are so sustained across the 20th century and now. But Angell, the journalist, was also alert to this. He asked refugees, "Shall we shut them up or shut them out?" A concise referencing both to the silencing of refugee voices and the hostility of wartime immigration policy. Anthropologist Lisa Malky describes refugees as speechless emissaries, meaning that, though highly visible in the media and represented by humanitarian administrators, they possess neither the voice nor the power to convey their own stories or possess decision-making powers. Angell, the journalist, senses that the European refugee was becoming an identity reflective of political uncertainties and ideological, ethnic and religious status. He said that there was a campaign against refugees, that the newspapers, the mainstream press, was waging a war on them. He says this in 1941. And there was also fear-mongering that British jobs would be swamped by the alien, quote. Yet such efforts to represent and empathetically represent refugees didn't actually guarantee any insight or any empathy. For news without refugee voices remains a problem today. Sociologist Nikos Papastagiadis notes that the ambient fears of the refugee are historically grounded, embedded in media reportage and wider cultures of visual representation. But after the war, the displaced person waiting to be rehoused or resettled was also a frequent image in the press and within UN media, widely circulated UN media, always keen to show that UNRWA or the IRO were aiding displaced persons to be citizens renewed. Gendered structures, and this is another trope that we've identified. We're using Cynthia Enlow's construct, woman and child. Gendered structures and symbols play a central role in what the political scientist Cynthia Enlow conceptualised as woman and child, an indistinguishable category. Ideals of femininity, passivity and humanity swirl around the female refugee, from religious art to political content to humanitarian imagery. Christian ideals of compassion and duty coalesce in the sacred role of the Madonna as useful universal mother, such as in Spanish Civil War relief campaigns for Republican war victims, and has been repeated across religious art, photography, anti-war posters, humanitarian causes, especially cases of starvation and deprivation in the global south. This is a very persistent image. Doesn't matter what country, where, it's the same depiction. In the 1950s, UN agencies such as UNCRA, the United Nations Korean Relief Administration during the Korean War, or UNICEF, continued to depict the most vulnerable and deserving people as a woman and child figure. The gendered victim is passive, ahistorical, universal, encompass all humanity. It doesn't matter where she's from, where she's fled from, whether it's the Izolzo front in the First World War, whether it's the Armenian genocide or the Korean War. Even her ethnicity can be erased so that her racialized otherness isn't so distinctive, as UNICEF's silhouetted figure down on the right suggests. Displaced children and young people also became cultural figures in this period that has sustained effective and aesthetic power despite this flattening out of experiences and identities. Women and children were also frequently depicted as the quintessential image of refugee mobility. The feminization of flight was captured by photojournalists and artists alike in both world wars. And this also gave an image of the desperation and deservingness of these people. Mobile, feminine families suggest that the hearth was broken. This is a conventional image that woman belongs at home, despite the fact that many women in the two world wars were involved in paramilitary organisations, in munitions manufacture, or even armed resistance in the two world wars. But women artists also contributed to this depiction. The Polish artist Tamara Lempicka had been twice displaced herself in her lifetime, from Russia in 1918 and then fleeing Paris in the 1930s with her Jewish husband. Compelled by what she was reading about in Europe from the United States where she was living, she depicted two portraits in very dark, sombre colours, in contrast to her usual oeuvre of colourful portraits of flappers and dandies. A tearful woman clutching her infant, and a mother and child staring with forlorn resignation in stasis, both figures of intense pathos, escape somewhere in Europe, the refugees. Conversely, the woman alone, without a male protector, a father or a husband, could be posed as beautiful and demure. Her downcast eyes suggest respectability, and that image of downcast eyes we often see in humanitarian posters as well. But they also lend a sensuality to her vulnerability. Her stillness also suggests the mysterious power of feminine beauty, while suggesting also conventional social roles and power relations. Youthful, feminine beauty rendered for the male gaze. Images of children alone, without parents, emerged in the aftermath of the First World War, and this is another trope. In tandem with the rise of humanitarian internationalism, especially efforts to address the child victims of hunger in Central Europe and in the aftermath of the Armenian genocide. Babies and young girls often featured in this imagery in pamphlets and in posters. This occurred at the same time that Eglantine Jebb, a woman with the most extraordinary English name, founded the charity Save the Children and campaigned for the rights of the child to be adopted by the League of Nations in 1924, the Geneva Convention, or Geneva Declaration. To be sure, in the course of the 20th century, the figure of the child alone became central to humanitarianism's moral discourse and its visual strategies deployed for political campaigning, public education and fundraising. In the Second World War, young Jewish children were the largest victims of murder and massacre. Those who arrived to England on the kinder transports were featured in newspaper images of rescue. The historian Tony Kushner argues that the children were welcomed and celebrated so long as they appeared grateful, happy, and normal. The dualism of unhappy, crying, pleading child, Armenia, Turkey, the Kurds, versus happy, rehabilitated or resilient child, a Dutch child in the Second World War, a Ukrainian child today, are symbols of the nation's courage and resistance. This has been sustained across the 20th and 21st centuries, and even Banksy suggests that kids will play in the ruins of a war zone. Visual tropes of children were central to refugeedom, had particular connotations in the context of the Cold War. Such tropes create a twofold vision of the child's world. Firstly, the refugee child's world is mired in domestic crisis, as children are detached from the space of home and the bond of family care. Images of displaced children newly clothed, fed and schooled, intended to show the child's world is stable, has also been very effective in terms of propping up interventions. Images of the child's return to the family, children who are actually detached from their families, are less prevalent. Across time and location, alone children speak to the moment of childhood crisis, whilst also suggesting the ahistorical and universal needs of all childhood, all children per se. After 1945, both the UN agencies commissioned or worked alongside photographers to address the huge scale of the millions of children in need, either separated from families or orphaned in DP camps or in refugee camps. Child refugees were depicted alone, separated from adult relatives in need of protection, food, clothing, shelter, and love, parental love. Even when their parents were actually with them, they were often depicted as orphans. UN photo books such as Therese Bonny's Europe's Children or David Seymour's Children of Europe, 1943 and 49, or documentary films such as The Search, 1948, represent orphan children in need, traumatised, yet potential agents of the future, whether that be rehabilitating them as future citizens of democratic nations. The Swedish photographer Per-Olof Andersson worked with UNRWA for a photo book on life in Palestine and Gaza with many photos of children. And the book proceeds were used to fund a disabled teenagers' operation in the United States. The dangers of lost childhood, as Tara Zara writes, gave a sense of urgency to the rehabilitation of children from figures of abandonment, poverty and malnutrition into figures of hope. Artists also acted towards this, but here is a little drawing by a 13-year-old artist in the Landsberg DP camp, Samuel Buck, who was a 13-year-old survivor of the Holocaust. But he depicted what he saw, which is also lone children, with deep empathy as they hold hands and venture forward into the unknown horizon beyond. While World Refugee Year, WRY, deployed artists to imagine the innocence and sweetness of the lone child, as you can see in the far right. Refugee children all over the world appear fundamentally lost to childhood. Separated from their families, they're intimate ciphers of alienation, but they also provoke deep emotional reactions when appearing in need of parenting. And when images of children crying, that heightened emotion is even more so. And this fed also into foreign adoption materials. The sweet, diminutive face in emotional turmoil suggests lost contact not just with parents, but with the entire foundation of the family system. But this also implicated mothers. The image of impoverished, abject and alone children was crucial to UN imagery and also implicated the precarity of motherhood. Ragged clothing, bare feet, eking out an existence in caves rather than homes, wretched faces crying, delinquent boys, symbols of extreme need of both intervention and the needs for homes, for material structures. Again, women and children belong in the home and both require rescue of aid organisations in the UN. But this also implicated political values. Unlearning the war, that's a quote from the United Nations. after images of humanitarian rescue. So smiling children signalled the success of rehabilitation and rescue in images. The happy child was a normal child, but also a child who could unlearn the horror and trauma of the war and relearn to be a child and to play and unlearn fascism. The role of UNRWA welfare workers was also emphasised as they stood in for civilised Western values and militarised motherhood. Children at play, but also at work, learning at school and being productive, such as making toys, was a common image of rehabilitation and reconstructed childhood. And UNRWA workers, very often images of women, sent in their own photos of the children that they regarded as their own successors. So there were photo competitions amongst UNRWA workers themselves, and their photos are even just as interesting, as you can see on the right-hand side, one of the prizes there. The final trope is materiality of refugeedom, and centres around this. Often you do see it around images of mobility and immobility, but also conditions of welfare. Objects related to transport hold particular significance in the materiality of mobility. It could be, from the First World War, it could be horses, horse-drawn carts, could be motor lorries, walking on foot. Objects relating to the body, especially clothing and shoes. The child with no shoes, that sort of Victorian 19th century image of raggedness, then gets repeated in the United Nations ad infinitum and the UNRWA, seeking to sort of overturn, so you get these sort of stories of a child who has no shoes and then who is given shoes, as this one story of Peter. Objects relating to mobility, such as passports, identity documents, also become a standard fare in museum displays. Tent cities were part of the landscape and infrastructure of military camps, whether permanent or impermanent. Camps such as in Jordan, camps were seen as temporary, such as El Shat in the Sinai Desert, but those images tend to be more forgotten. But museums have started to collect passports and identity documents, and artists are also frequently reprising the image of the tent in contemporary work around refugees. I just wanted to conclude in the last little bit about the exhibition that we're working with lots of artists from backgrounds of forced displacement. And this is just a couple of images from the exhibition Traces of Displacement at the Whitworth Art Gallery. One of them is sort of troubling, the image of the rescue of Yazidi women, this one down the bottom right, troubling the knowability through images, making it much more bleached out, the knowability of the rescue of Yazidi women from Mount Sinjar. That's also social practice artists who've worked, for example, in the immigration removals centres in England. Nana Vafaropoulou's No Man's Land, where she actually worked with men about to be removed, some of whom have been in immigration detention for many, many years. Australia and Britain have the dubious honour of being one of the few countries that has indefinite detention for asylum seekers. And Safdar Ahmed's Refugee Art Project in Sydney, where he has worked with families and children in immigration detention. So we're kind of trying to use that to sort of give voice to people, to have their own voice, and to address some of these problems in the traditions and the conventions of displacement aesthetics through social practice works and through collaboration with artists. I'm just going to end going just a little bit back in time. I was searching for something to do with Sweden. And I just wanted to leave you with a sort of a lesser-known history of sick and tubercular displaced persons who came to Sweden for treatment when many other countries would not provide them with medical care or sanctuary because they were considered the so-called hardcore, the sick, the disabled, the elderly, who couldn't be rehabilitated as citizens. Now, these photos were created by the Jewish Distribution Committee and showed that care for patients could be achieved and would rebuild the strength of the Jewish family. These aren't very well-known images, but they were circulated amongst Jewish communities around the world through the JDC. So I will leave you with that nice reminder that there are alternative stories.
Thank you so much. We have time for questions. There's immediately one.
Hi, thank you for these presentations. That's such an important topic to research. I come from Colombia, a country that for over 60 years it experienced an internal conflict, and it actually created a displacement of about 5 million people internally. But the thing was that is because it lasted for so long, it became like a sort of invisible phenomenon. So it was more like the task of research, of journalism, of artists to make it more visible, to just put faces to the people that are involved in this conflict. So in contrast to the examples that you have shown, the massive phenomena like war and stuff, of just some periods, shorter period, not 60. So I remember I only addressed that topic once when some years ago, I defended my PhD dissertation that I showed some of images of a friend of mine, an artist. And now, in retrospect, because I never continued that research on also working in these images of mobility. But in retrospect, I find many elements of what he did in his own paintings, also based on photographs, and now all the examples that you have shown. And I see one of the similarities is the point of view of regardless if it is an illustration or a photograph or a painting, that there is always this like seeing the group of people coming towards you, or seeing the group of people going away, or from the sideways, and then a bit raising the eye view higher and then lower, and that's quite. Regardless of the images, there is this common element in many of them, and that they might say something about the picture itself, because if you put the group like you are sideways and look it, the group is always passing by you. So it places you in the position of what is your decision, what is going to be as a viewer, what's your stand, like where are you standing. If it is lower, it can be like when you lower the perspective, it makes the figures to look more monumental. But at the same time, it might render different views. So either you are sitting down doing nothing, or perhaps you are a child also watching people passing by. So there's a lot of elements that are so fascinating, and I just really thank you that with this presentation I kind of made in retrospective to kind of connect the dots in so many.
Thank you for that comment, because it reminds me that as you say, like the viewpoint of the person who might be taking the image. So the passerby, for example, you really do see that with the newsreels, the early newsreels. It's sort of a matter of the technique of the camera, because they've just literally got the camera there, and they might pan across, or the person enters the frame and the row of people enters the frame and exits the frame. Equally, some photographs of camps are always taken from an aerial view to get that long distance, that these are millions and millions of tents, rows and rows of tents. So aerial perspectives are quite, so that's another kind of perspective I didn't really go into. As you say, lowering the perspective, looking up, making someone look bigger than they are. I think all of these sort of techniques of the camera are another layer of analysis that that we need to look into as well. As for internally displaced persons, it's a good question as to whether the same kinds of techniques are used, same kinds of tropes are used when we're talking about internally displaced people, just speaking about Colombia, for example. I don't know the answer to that, but I think that I suspect it'd be fairly similar, but it might just be that some of these tropes are actually embedded in 19th century or go way back to biblical times, and they're just so embedded in Western imaginaries that it doesn't matter whether it's a photograph or a poster or a print. We imagine the ultimate image of deservingness, of passivity, of helplessness, of voicelessness. Although it's a humanitarian aesthetic, an attempt to provide help, it also very disempowering.
Thank you.